Hello, guys. Welcome back. My name is Dre. I'm a customer success engineer here at Moveworks. I'll be our host for today's Creator Studio weekly webinar session. Let's go ahead and discuss really quickly some of the upcoming sessions that are scheduled for the following weeks. But today we'll be discussing Concur expense report approvals. Next week we'll be discussing Ariba purchase requisition approvals, and then the following week on September 25th, our SailPoint IIQ access request approvals. You'll notice a theme here. We're doing sort of an approvals month with the month of September. So certainly tune in. I think that all of these sessions will have aspects that are relevant to even other kinds of approval systems. So certainly recommend joining these. Of course, today we're going to be discussing Concur expense report approvals. We'll have a conversation about what this means as far as setup goes. I'm going to give sort of an example of one kind of approvals integration that you might configure. And then I actually want to share some additional ways that you might go about doing this approval. So at the heart of it, we're using Concur APIs in order to facilitate approval lookups and then approvals. But there are certainly a handful of ways to make this proactive or maybe different kinds of interactions. Again, all based within the same API though. So I think it should be straightforward. Finally, we'll have a Q&A session. We'll just sort of save any of your questions you have from the content portion of this call. We'll be able to dive into that a little bit more. I figure I'll give a little bit of extra time just because, again, there is a lot of different ways you might want to approach this particular problem. But again, at the end of the day, the toolbox that we're going to use to approach that problem is more or less the same. So let's go ahead and jump into the content then. So Concur expense report approvals are really just a very common system for our customers to want to integrate with, allowing for these expense reports to be queried in chat by an approver, as well as for the approver to say, yes or no, I approve or deny that approval request. All of these are sort of functionalities that folks are looking to build. And so this session is just going to cover the generalities of how you would do that, what that would sort of look like for your approvers and for your requesters. And then, again, we'll have a Q&A session so we can talk a bit more about that. So the specific user experience that we want to build today is going to be this sort of the approvers coming to the bot. Can you show me the pending expense approvals? And then it's going to pull those expense approvals, present them to the user for them to then say, okay, I want to find out more information about that expense request, get that information. And then we're going to leave it at that. But I am going to discuss about how you would actually submit the API request or reconfigure this use case to be for actually submitting the approval. And you'll notice I kind of added this just as a call out. The specific use case we're building that I'll show in MA or in our internal bot is going to be looking up approvals for other approvers. The reason being that we're leveraging a demo instance for some of these API calls. So we need to specify an email. But in real life, my guess is you would be building this to say, can you show me what pending expense approvals I have in Concur? And then you would pass the the approver's email address. So we'll talk about that more when we get to the API portion of things. This is a very high level architecture diagram. It's skipping authentication with Concur. It's also skipping sort of what kinds of information we might want to configure in our Creator Studio use case. But I think it does give us a pretty good general high level overview again of this use case. So you'll notice right off the bat that this is going to be a queries use case. And I'm mentioning either first queries use case and second queries use case or follow-up action. What I mean by this is that there is potential to approach this in multiple different ways. I've sort of alluded to that before. But specifically, we need a queries use case at least to allow the approver to query and ask for what are the pending approvals for my user or for X user if you need that configured that way for some reason. That queries use case is then going to actually query the approvals table in Concur using this expense reports API. I've configured some URL parameters such as limit, approval status code, user, and approver login ID. My recommendation here is to use approver login ID and then reference it as a user.email adder. We'll talk about that when we look at the queries use case. And then it will come back with the various approvals that are pending this user. In this case, it means records with some workflow action pending that is going to be an approval. Once we get back that return, we can structure the data, show that to our end users, and then either move on to a second queries use case, in the case of Copilot, which can take that context from the prior response and then go ahead and pass that to another use case, or we can use a follow-up action, such that maybe you get back a list of approvals. You say, tell me more about approval one. It tells you about that, and then it offers you as an option, would you like to approve or deny? So a couple of different ways to approach that here. So let's go ahead and take a step back. I want to go ahead and just share the APIs we're going to use. I think that it really is the sort of most important part. And then I want to look through an example use case that we've built in Creator Studio. The big one, though, that I wanted to call out is how do you actually approve? This is the first part of this workflow that's a little bit different, maybe specific to Concur even. And that's that when you make an approval, you actually need to use XML. So a lot of the times when we're talking about Creator Studio, we're talking about JSON request bodies for our API calls. This is a sort of rare example where we are talking about having an XML request body. This actually would get filtered and added into your Creator Studio use cases as part of the follow-up action. And you definitely can configure that in the path request body section when you're configuring that API call. The actual call itself, though, looks something like this. So you'll have this sort of URL for workflow action. Concur works on workflows. And so the overall process that we're taking here is we first get an API token. We then get the pending approval. So again, this is that API call we were referencing earlier. And in this case, I'm asking for this specifically API calls for this user, or approvals specific for this user, are Kolati at moveworks.ai. Once we get that, you'll notice in the API response that you get this workflow action URL. This is the actual URL you're using to approve or deny that request. So you take this, copy that just for a moment if we need it. And then again, this is sort of just a formatted version of the same thing. You'll make a post API call to that workflow action URL. So I'm going to go ahead and just leave it as what it was, but know that that's what that URL is. And then you structure your body using this XML. So action in this case is approve. Oops. And maybe you want to add a comment. You would pull this maybe in like a path use case or something along those lines, and then actually submit that. And that would move the request to the next stage of the workflow, and in doing so, approve. Now, if you wanted to deny, simply replace this to deny. I think it's deny. Let's double check let's see, deny, reject. Well, it's whatever the action is. So maybe it's recall to employee. It's like approve, send back to employee, or recall to employee. So then your API call would look something along those lines. Now, I think it maybe makes more sense to look at it in the context of building the use case. So let's look at that very briefly. Again, I want to save extra time for questions. So this is our demo use case. You can see it's called demo concur expense approvals, query concur expense approvals by approver email. Go ahead and click next. We have an OAuth 2 configuration for our authentication here. I won't share those details explicitly, but we can talk about how to build that. The headers here, we're going to simply set accept application JSON parameters. We're going to set limit approval status code. I use user and approver login ID. I think this just makes things a little bit more explicit, but simply experiment a little bit maybe with the parameters of what you're trying to actually query. Sort of one of the many places where customization is an option here. You'll notice here that I'm referencing limit equals 10. The reason here being that you really don't want to even consider displaying more than 10 options. Generally speaking, I would recommend limiting it to 5, but just to be safe, I've set it to 10. But in a production use case, I would recommend setting that to 5. Approval status code is simply saying that we want to check for things that are pending approvals. Users all, and then approver login ID. This is going to be the query. So earlier I mentioned you would probably want to set this up with user.email adder as the variable. This would pull the requesting user, meaning their user who's chatting to the bot, their email address. And what this would do is mean that there's no actual information needed from the end user. What they really are just saying is, I want to see what the Concur approvals are, and it's going to pull back any Concur expense approvals that are relevant to that end user who's making that request. Today, though, again, for construction purposes, really, I'm just going to leave this as a query, and I can show you where that query gets pulled in a moment. Body here, this is just the querying portion of this API call. So where you're going to get HTTPS www.concursolutions.com, and then the API call we're making is this expense reports API call. Now, again, if this were the step where you're actually doing the approval, you would say post, you would change this to be that API call that we were referencing here. Go ahead and pull that in just to show you what that looks like. And then perhaps we want to replace this with a query. Maybe we want to have the end user pass that ID. Probably not. This seems a little bit complicated. The alternative action here would be to not actually have this be the post step, but to have the follow-up action of this specific use case be that post step, or referencing it from a prior queries use case. So again, you would use that query variable here, but it would be basically being pulled from prior context. So a little bit more complicated there. It's harder to describe. So I want to stick with this and then just show what a follow-up action might be look like. So let's go ahead and go back. This next, just want to make sure that we have our example response here. You can see all of the data that's coming back for our example response. For our follow-up action, the really useful one here is going to be this workflow action URL. We do want to make sure that we're pulling that in. And then we just need information in order to show the end user. So that's going to be relevant in the API labeling step. Go ahead and move to that. Okay. In the API labeling step, I've gone ahead and set the name of the approval request as the identifier for the record. I have the description set to the owner name, Will Davis. This is just to, in my mind, you want to basically have whatever the title is of the approval request, plus who is actually making that approval. Those are probably the most relevant pieces of information. So to me, those become the sort of identifier and description of the request. Other important information are things like amount due, approval status. Again, very, very customizable. So if you have some of these custom fields that are relevant, you can go ahead and include those. In our case, we do not have any customized fields, so we're going to skip those. I do like to include the ID. This is just helpful information. Occasionally, if an end user needs to see what the approval is, perhaps they have some other additional tool they want to leverage. Payment status, submit date, and URI. URI is very, very important because this will allow the end user to select the approval link and go directly to the portal in case they need additional information that's not included or not configured for being included in our use case. Once we have all this data configured, we can go ahead and click Next. Right now, I have no follow-up action, but if we did want to do a follow-up action, we could either redirect to a URL, and in this case, the URL would be the URL that we have queried here, this URI, or we could do ask clarifying questions and execute a solution. So the question might be something along the lines of, would you like to approve or deny this request? Click Next. And then we have the option to basically pull in the data from our configurations here, add bot questions such as execute an API. So if we have that yes or no question, maybe we ask a question, would you like to approve or deny? We'll let the bot generate a variable that we can leverage then later on if we need to. We also are going to offer the options here of approve or deny. We can click create question. And then for the approve action, we would execute an API. Again, this is going to be a post API call. We're going to actually be referencing that URI that came from before, and then configuring the body using the XML structure that we provided here. Let's go ahead and go back here to API labeling. I'm going to discard my changes very quickly because I actually do not want to make this change, but just to sort of point out how that would work. I hope that makes sense. Again, let's ask questions here in a moment if they do not. Finally, triggering and parameters. You'll notice that each one of these triggers, triggering utterances, have an email associated. That is because the email is, in this case, our query. And so a lot of these examples that the bot is providing us, how can I check the status of my expense report? These do not have a query identified, and that's specified here. Identified is not identified in this utterance. So if I were to add this as a should trigger utterance, I would want to go find it down here. How can I check the status of my expense report in Concur? Edit slot identification. How can I check the status of, maybe I want to say the expense report in Concur for Jane Doe at org.com. We want to make sure again that we're adding sort of an example email address for the bot to identify as the query. So we're going to go ahead and say another part of the utterance should it be identified, and we're going to give the bot that information. So in this case, we want to say query, in this case, needs to be jane.doe@org.com for this utterance that specifies that email address. We just save this, you'll notice that it's down here now, and there is in fact a query associated with that utterance. So just to show you sort of how you would edit an utterance in this case. Finally, click next. We want to launch the selected emails. And in our case, I'm only launching to myself. This is just a test sort of demo example. But in real life, you would want to go ahead and select, launch to all users, something along those lines. So with that, I mean, we are running a really long time, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. I am going to go ahead and just open things up here in a moment after I share some additional resources. I have a demo if we'd like to look at it, but it is a little bit different. So I want to go ahead and just start with this, and we can move on to questions about the APIs. I think that's again the sort of meat of how things are going here. So if you are interested in building use cases yourself, I would highly, highly recommend checking out our Creator Studio Developer Certification course. I would consider this required learning before you even begin to work in Creator Studio. This is a set of guided training modules which cover key concepts and learning objectives, step-by-step videos that sort of walk you through building example use cases in your own Creator Studio instance, and then finally a multiple choice exam with a certification that you can share on LinkedIn in case you want to share with others your own capability within the platform. Finally, is our documentation and developer community. The documentation portal you can think of as your reference resource for all things Moveworks, both including Creator Studio as well as Moveworks Setup and other platforms and functionalities of Moveworks. Here you can see tutorials and use case guides that I would particularly like to call out for today's session, which are going to walk you through step-by-step building new use cases in your platform, very much like how we have that in our Academy course, except this is different use cases, more use cases, things that will be able to spark ideas for your own kinds of use cases that you might want to build in integrations. Finally, is our developer community. You can think of this as your forum to ask anything about Creator Studio use cases or really, again, anything else Moveworks related. Lots of different personalities who are going to be in that forum, myself included, as well as product managers and owners, other customers who have experienced similar issues. Really just a sort of communal resource for Moveworks related questions. Thank you very much for joining us. Again, please keep your eyes peeled for that community post, and I hope you guys have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.